Morning, everybody. Welcome to another Jadu Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about conditional sections and branching in Jadu Connect forms, Jadu Central forms, I should say. Um, so this is something that's standard functionality out of the box. It's relatively simple to use, but it is something that we tend to get a lot of questions around when people are trying to manage sections or branching within a form. So I'm going to jump in and start running through some of the basics. We'll talk about some use cases and some potential ideas where you might want to use sort of more complex ideas around branching or conditional sections. So I said, I've got my basic form. I want to create a conditional section on this page. So if I go in to edit that page, I've got my question, what's your inquiry about? And I've got responses for thing A and thing B. If I go back in to add a section, I've got my conditional section option or section option. I can either drag that in or just select add to my main section. As I said before I started showing my screen, you can have sections that always display if you wanted to break the page up with subheadings. So you'd put your subheading in the title field and you'd select to show the title. But more often than not, you tend to be using sections conditionally to ask context-specific questions based on something someone's responded to within the page. So I'm going to call this section, let's call it thing A. And I want to show this conditionally. You have a number of different options, so you can select whether you're showing it based on a comparison of a response, based on the day, time, whether it's being submitted via an internal form or via the website, or by user type. We're going to keep this simple and do it based on a comparison of a response. So if I select comparison of, I'll choose my question. So there's only one question in this page, so it's going to just bring up that one question. When you're adding a conditional section in based on a question response, it will only show you questions within that page of the form. So we can't use a previous question in a form in quite this way. I will show you a way that you can do it a little bit later. So I'm going to say, based on comparison of what your inquiry is about being equal to thing A, we will show this section. And it then gives me a new sort of target area where I can add any questions that I just want to appear when someone says their inquiry is about thing A. So I'm just going to keep this simple for the moment and put a text block in there to tell us about thing A. And let's make that required. So one of the key things you can do with conditional sections is if you've got questions that you specifically want to ask someone based on a selection, rather than them just having an optional question within the page structure itself, where you're saying, if you've answered this, then please answer this question. What this allows you to do is to actually make those questions mandatory, because it will only expose that question when someone selects the relevant option. And it will only treat that question as mandatory if that section is exposed within the page. So here, if someone says they're interested in thing A, they have to answer the tell me about thing A question. If I had another section for thing B, again, conditional based on a comparison of what is your inquiry about being equal to thing B this time, then I can have my text area in there. That's about thing B, and I can make it required. So in the context of the page, if someone's answered thing A and they've put their mandatory response in here, it's not going to treat the thing B question as mandatory because it won't have exposed that section in the page. So if I go back to my form structure and just show you that, Let's make my form live. Let's just fill in my details. Skip those because they're optional. So here, when I get to what's my inquiry about, if I select thing A, I get my question, tell me about thing A. If I select thing B, I get the other question. So that's a very simple example of a conditional section. Obviously, you can have multiple questions within that conditional section if you need to. The alternative to sort of conditional sections is really branching within a page. So let me add that page in again. Let's call this branching example. Let's create a new version of it. So I'm just going to take the conditional sections out of this version of the template. So let's say that rather than using a conditional section, what I want to do is actually I want to send the customer down a totally different journey through the form based on what they've selected. What I could do is create a branch. So again, this is simple standard functionality. So in this case, I could say, let's have that back in. What I want to do is based on a response on this page is send someone down a totally different route. So if they select thing A, then I want to send them somewhere else. So let's say actually if they select thing A, I want to send them to a dead end. I'll talk more about dead ends in a minute, but I'll create a branching example. Let's just put some content in here. So in this instance, I can then choose to create a branch. Again, you've got various options here, similar to conditional sections, a set that you can branch based on any question you've previously asked in the form. So it doesn't have to be a question on the page. And you can branch based on whether a user's visited a specific page in the form as well. So I'm going to stick with comparison of what is your inquiry about, let's say being equal to thing A. So what this does is splits off a totally separate route through the form. So there may be a number of pages that then come off that incorrect page if you were thinking of gathering a whole sort of subset of data based on a customer choice. But in this example, if I go back to the form now, this time, instead of opening up a section within the page, it will take me to another page within the form and potentially, as I said, a separate route through the information. So those are sort of very basic examples of how conditional sections and branching work, as a basic premise. What you may want to do. So I've got a question from Aisha. Did you hide the next button on the dead end page? Yes, yeah. What I've done, I'll talk about dead ends in a moment, just in a bit more detail, but effectively I've got a code snippet in that page that hides the next button. What it allows me to do is have a single dead-end template that I can use in any form at any point within my environment. So I'm going to take these out temporarily and talk about some different use cases. So let's think about another example where you may use a conditional section. So if I go into my customer details template, I'm using an address lookup based on postcode for my customer's address. Now, it may be that maybe it's a brand new property and the customer's address hasn't been added to the Gazetteer database yet. So maybe what we want to do is give people the opportunity to manually enter their address if they can't find it via the lookup. So this is another use case where we would use a conditional section. So I would drop that in a section in underneath my address lookup. Let's call this manual address. What I want to do in this instance is show it based on a comparison of, and let's find my address lookup question. So I want to select my UPRN being equal to I cannot find my property. So if the customer selects that option, we will then expose this section. I can drop a text area in there. Let's say, please enter your address, including postcode. And I can then make that required as well. So in that instance, if I go back to my form, let's begin again. If I choose I cannot find my property, then it gives me the option to manually enter my address. One thing to think about if you're doing this kind of thing, where based on a response to a question, you might want to return either the response here for property or the response to the manual question. So, if I've selected this address, I want that. If I've selected I can't find my property, then I want this returned as the address, potentially in a email confirmation or being passed into Connect into a field. So in this instance, to figure out which of those responses to return, I would just add a bit of logic into the form. So if I go back to my form structure and select logic, let's call this address. Let's call it customer address, actually. I can use some predefined logic that comes out of the box, which is value of A or value of B if A is empty. So question A is going to be my manual address question, because what I want to do is if someone has chosen I can't find my property, then there's going to be no UPRN returned from the address lookup. So the empty question would be question B, which would be the address lookup. So what I want to effectively say is if this question is empty, return the response to this question. So based on that logic, if someone can't find their property in the address lookup, it's going to return the response to this question. If someone has selected a property from the address lookup, it's going to return the response to this question. If I'm passing it into a text field in Connect, I would simply change that to be the label as well, because the label would be empty. So in that case, I could just pass this one piece of logic into a single field. So, obviously, the other way I could do it could be by using a branch and branching to a manual address page. Um, the reason I'm not doing that in this instance is because I'm trying to keep all of the questions related to the customer details on one page. So it's one page that clearly just captures that information. So what I tend to do with differentiating between branching and using conditional sections is determining whether actually I need to send the customer down an entirely different route through the form, which, as I've said before, would be an instance where you'd use branching, or whether I'm simply asking for a little bit of additional information based on a response they've made within that page, in which case I normally tend to use conditional sections. If you have a lot of questions based on a customer response, then I would also potentially use branching so that you can break those questions up into sort of smaller chunks rather than them all sitting on the one page. So let's say I want to do something slightly different. Let's say I want to have a conditional section in the page, but based on something the customer's answered previously in the form. So let me go in and drop my, let's use this template. So let me drop this one in. So just as an example, this probably isn't an actual use case, but it's really just to show you the concept of how you would do something if you want to base it on a previous response that has a conditional section rather than a branch. So what I'm going to do on my manual address page is I am going to go in here and I am going to add a pre-fill. So I would do this normally using sort of say a hidden section. Do it based on something that I know exactly what I'm going to put in. So I'm going to add a hidden field here that I'm going to populate with some data. And then I'm going to add a section conditionally based on what's in that hidden field. So let's say if it's equal to my name, let's just move that question into here. So what I then want to do is I want to take a response from this first page, your details, and I need to pass it into my second page in order to trigger that conditional section. So I'm going to add a pre-fill. So if I come across to the pre-fills link, I'm going to add a pre-fill and I'm going to pre-fill first name with the response to the question first name from my your details page. So if I go back to my form, let's put Bob in there. Yeah. Because I put Bob in, that question's not appearing. Let's change that. Now, because I put Paul in, that question is going to appear based on that condition that I put into the page. So we're taking the response from this page, pushing it into the second page, and then displaying the conditional section based on that response being equal to a specific value. So there's lots of use cases where you might use that. It might be based on something that you're pulling across from a case in Jadu Central and Jadu Connect. So, for example, maybe you want to build into all of your workflows in Jadu Connect the ability for someone to provide feedback on their experience. You want to use one single feedback form, but you want to potentially ask slightly different questions depending on what the particular service was that the customer had requested. In which case, you could pull across the case reference. I jump into Connect. Let's just find some of our workflows. So let's say I want to get feedback based on a graffiti enforcement complaint. So each case type in Connect has got its own unique prefix. So if we pull across the case reference from Connect into our feedback form, we could display a conditional section based on that prefix. So we talked about how you pass that data over to Jadu Central from Connect on a previous masterclass. So I won't go over back all of that in detail again. But what I could do, let's just edit my manual address page again. What I want to do is, let me go into my customer details. Let's make my case reference field visible so you can see what's happening. I'm just going to go in and just edit this page. Let's make that specific. So in this instance, what I want to do is show my conditional section based on there being a specific prefix passed over. So in this case, EGF. So I'm just going to change my conditional section to be based on that unique case prefix. And then I am going to update my prefill so that rather than coming from first name, I'm going to take it from the case reference field. So go back to my form. So let's say I have pulled over my case reference from the case. So EGF. I have a slight error, I think. Let me just double check what I've set it as. So I need to change that from is equal to contains. So I've got my case reference EGF 000001. And then I get, please tell us more about your experience reporting graffiti. If I had used pulled over a different case reference for a different type of case, let's find a different one. So let's say bus shelter issue. Oh, we got that one, BSI. Let's change it to BSI. Then I don't get asked to tell them about my experience reporting graffiti. So you could use this to craft potentially quite a complex feedback form where you're asking for specific feedback depending on what the individual use case was and what it was that the customer was reporting. But you can effectively use one feedback form across all case types. So are there any questions so far? I know I've talked about quite a few things already. So just close some of these tabs. So one thing I popped on here on the agenda was talking about using conditional sections for things like contact center scripts and questions. And that's a bit of a red herring because quite often we get asked how to use conditional sections to do that kind of thing. But actually, you can do it out of the box without needing a conditional section. So I'm just going to show you something that you can do with your questions. That's standard functionality, but we do get asked about it quite a lot. So again, let me go into my manual address question. In fact, let me do it on the first page to make things simpler. So let's say I want to add some scripting information to this page for contact center users. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a section. And I could do that based on the user type. Not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a text block. Let's call this instructions internal. And I'm going to edit my content to put in my internal scripting content. I'm going to say, please ask the customer for the following details. They must provide an address. And let's add that in there. Now, all questions or form elements that you add, you have the option of deciding whether that should show internally and whether it should show publicly. By default, it selects both. So whenever you create a form in Jadu Central, there's always a public-facing version of the form that's accessible via the website. And then there's always a internal version of the form for people like contact center staff that can be accessed via the internal forms section. So generally, we recommend using internal forms if you have staff filling out forms on behalf of the customer. I think I possibly mentioned this before, but the main reasons for this is it will automatically record details of which staff member has completed the form on behalf of the customer, so that you have a full audit trail and you know exactly who literally typed the form. But also it gives you the ability to do this kind of thing that I'm just showing you, where you can add either sort of text blocks for things like scripting content for internal staff, or you can add internal only questions. So if I only want this to show internally, I obviously don't want this to appear to the customer on the front end of the form. I'll switch off show publicly and add that text block. Let's just move it up to the top of the page as well. So if I go to this form as a customer via the website, that information doesn't appear. If, however, as an internal member of staff, I go into it via the internal forms to complete it on behalf of the customer, I get my contact center script. Um, Now the field for adding text blocks is rich text, so you can format it, you can add headings in, you can do anything you need to make that stand out. But effectively, it gives you that ability. So the other thing you might want to do is things like adding, um, internal only questions. So maybe if it's a member of staff filling in the form, what we want to do is capture how the customer contacted them, so we can track it for things like channel shift. So I might add a drop down question in. Let's put it here. Let's just call it contact method. I can add some responses in. Let's say face to face, telephone, email. Let's add social media in as well. So I can add those questions in. Again, I'll make it required, but I'm going to switch off show publicly. If I return to here, if I refresh my form submission, again, on the public facing version of the form, that question doesn't appear. If I go to the internal forms view, then I'm asked to select the contact method. So as I said, a bit of a red herring in terms of conditional sections. You don't need to use conditional sections for that. But it is a question we get asked a lot. With people asking, would you use a conditional section for it? So I thought I'd include it in this masterclass just because there's a kind of a bit of a crossover with it. So to come back to dead ends, so we've got a question in the chat about explaining how we hide the next button. So someone's asking how we explain how the next button on dead end page template and viewing internal form. Okay, so there's actually a code snippet that we have that will hide it on both the internal and the external view of the form. So I can share the snippet with everyone. So what I tend to do in terms of dead ends, if I go to page templates, I normally set up a single dead end template that I can then use, as I mentioned, across any form, any branch, because I can edit this error message once I've added that page to the actual form that I want to use it in without affecting the template because it sits in the instructions area. And then within the instructions itself, I also have my placeholder with my code snippet that hides the next button. So this will hide the next button both on the web version of the form and the internal version of the form. So I think previously we had a snippet that would only do it on the front end on the website. Because of changes to the way that some of the templates work, there's now the ability to do that with internal forms. So I can share that placeholder. Or if anybody wants it, I can literally export this page template and send it to you. So let's just approve that because it's a shared template. So I said, as long as you're using the edit instructions and not text blocks or questions in the page to display your error message, then you can use a single dead end template, and that's all you'll ever need in your forms environment, just the one. So I can use this dead end template in any of these forms where it's relevant. And literally all I do is when I add my template in, I can literally just change the page title and the content that's displayed to the user. So if I've got my dead end, Um, I said literally I can change that. I can change my error message, and I can save that. And because that's in the instructions, when I save it, it's not going to affect the default template. It's just going to affect the instance within the form itself where I've used it. So as I said, I could use that template multiple times in the same form, different titles and different error messages. So any other questions so far on that? Richard, I'll make sure I'll send you that code snippet. So thank you for asking that question. Okay. So other examples where you might want to use conditional sections. So most recent example that's a really good one that I can think of is recently was building a form for booking visits to the local recycling centre for a customer. With that, in that instance, potentially you've got 4 different recycling centres, all with different opening hours. And you want someone to be able to pick a recycling centre and present to them times that are available for them to visit and book based on that individual recycling centre. So in that example, you'd simply have a drop-down question that says, which recycling centre do you want to book? And then based on their response, you'd use a conditional section to present the correct booking question to them. So has anyone got any questions about examples where they think they might want to use conditional sections or branches? So Aisha's asked about internal forms. Is that backend CMS view only? Yes, it's directly within the control center. So someone would have to have access to internal forms in the control center to do that. What I would normally tend to do is for users that need to be able to complete forms on behalf of a customer, I would tend to create a dedicated role for them that just has access to internal forms and potentially Moto payments in PayBridge. So if I go to utilities and admin privileges, if I go to roles, I've got one here for contact center advisor. And with this, I've literally just given them access to internal forms and Moto payments. So they can log into the control center, but they would only have access to forms when they select that. They'd only see internal forms, they'd have access to PayBridge, and they'd only have access to Moto payments. So that would allow a contact center advisor to complete a form on behalf of the customer, for you to use those scripting elements, and for you to capture details of who it was that actually filled the form in. And then they'd also be able to take the payment on behalf of a customer if that's relevant as well. Another question we've got is, can you have a section within a section? Yes, you can. So if I go to my form, I'm going to my page where I've got a section. Yeah, I could literally go in here. So if I had a section, you'll see I've got the option to add it to the main section or my address section. So I could say add it to address. Go to another section within a section. I can drop that in. So I've then got a conditional section within a conditional section. You can do that. I would tend to limit that, because if you end up with lots of subsections within a section, you can sometimes end up in danger of potentially the page timing out if there's a lot of information the customer needs to input. So rather than sections within sections, sometimes I would potentially use a branch as an alternative option to send the customer down a different route if there was a lot of information that I was going to be capturing. Equally, sections are quite useful to use if you're looking at something where you could end up with lots and lots of different branches depending on what the customer answers. So sometimes branching can get very complex. If you're trying to branch based on a combination of different things, you might end up with, 10 different routes that you might need to send the customer down, based on analyzing what all the possible combinations of responses might be. So in those examples, it might be simpler to use conditional sections as well. I mean, hopefully that's given you a bit more insight into conditional sections, particularly, and branching. Branching, we get less questions about. Conditional sections, we get lots of questions about. As always, if you have any questions, you can always let me know. But thank you for your time again today. And hopefully we'll see you all again next month for the next masterclass.